Morning, everybody. David Shapiro here with your daily State of the Industry address. Okay, so this is going to be a doozy. There's a lot going into this. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about GPUs and AI art and large language models. That is kind of, that's my shtick. But got to zoom out, take the long view, take the macro view. So, some folks are worried that China will invade Taiwan. And what does this have to do with anything? Well, part of the price of GPUs is supply chain, but also where chips are made. So if China invades Taiwan, then there's likely to be a large disruption to chip manufacturers. Now, that doesn't mean that GPUs are going to be affected, but other chips might be, et cetera, et cetera. So some good news here. The Pentagon says that China will not invade Taiwan in the next 2 years. So we've got a reprieve there. If it's accurate, who knows? The U.S. Department of Defense puts a lot of attention on China. They publish a military report every year about China's capabilities and what they expect China's going to be able to do. And I read that every now and then. Anyways, so no disruption there. Hopefully, cross your fingers. Still, there is some Cold War-esque escalation happening. U.S. bars advanced tech firms, and this is only federally funded. It's not all tech firms, from building China factories for 10 years. So clearly something is going on behind the scenes in terms of what the U.S. expects China to do. I saw in the immediate aftermath of this, some people suspect that this could backfire because it'll force China to build their own AI chip tech companies, and then they might do it better than us. Who knows? In similar news, U.S. officials order NVIDIA to halt sales to top AI chips to China. It's all in the same bar, right? So who knows what's going on? But in the long run, hopefully one of the results of this is that we're less dependent on a single source of chips, such as Taiwan. And then we also have more access to GPU and other AI hardware. Because one of the biggest constraints right now in our field, ours being large language models and transformers in general, is access to affordable hardware in order to run these things. So another thing that could help this is Ethereum has completed the merge, which they're going from proof of work to proof of stake. I'll post a link if you want to understand that a little bit better. But the short version is that GPU mining is kaput for Ethereum. Now, obviously, Ethereum is not the only cryptocurrency, but it is the largest. And this move comes in the wake of a lot of states and nations and cities just flat out banning cryptocurrency mining. And like there have been cases where there's just like racks and racks and racks of used GPUs for sale because suddenly the demand for the GPUs is gone. Now, this makes sense from an environmental policy standpoint because the amount of power being consumed for cryptocurrency mining was ludicrous. So it was an irresponsible decision to make Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these things require just tremendous amounts of juice to mine. So I definitely agree with this, but also what it will do is it will allow the market to correct and allow GPUs to be bought and used for things that GPUs ought to be bought for and used for, such as actual gaming. If you're a gamer, there's a while where every time NVIDIA came out with a new GPU, they were all bought up literally within seconds of hitting Newegg and eBay and whatever else, and they were being bought by bots actually, and the prices were being bid up to double and triple their market value. So that was absurd and it was frustrating. But now you can actually get GPUs. Just walk into your local computer store and buy one off the shelf because they're no longer just the supply chain is being fixed. So why am I bringing this up though? Bloom is the latest open source model, and it is roughly equivalent to GPT-3, 176 billion parameters. And let's see. It takes, depending on how you deploy it, it takes 768 gigabytes of GPU RAM or 352 at half precision. I'm wondering if people do the distill it down to int 8, if you could cut that in half again and get it down to what's that, 175 gig of RAM. That's still a lot bigger than any of us can afford right now. But with ongoing refinement and also availability of more data center grade GPUs. So here's the thing. I've got an NVIDIA RTX 2070 in my computer. It's getting old, but it's big enough. It's got 8 gig of RAM. It's big enough to run some smaller models. But maybe in a year or two, if I keep this up, I'll be able to get something a little bit bigger, or a pair of things that are a little bit bigger, and I'll be able to run something like Neo X locally. So Neo X, it looks like for inference, this helpful blog says that Neo X took about 40 gigabytes across 2 GPUs. So that's, you get two 24 gig GPUs, which that's going to be within reach soon. We can start running these at full bore locally without having to pay for APIs, which that's going to do a lot for security. So one of the biggest things, and I did see that Microsoft Azure, if you use large language models on Azure, they are actually HIPAA compliant. That is a big concern that a lot of people have. So when I tested out Forefront, they have a very simple ability to just turn off logging, right? But just because you can turn off logging does not mean that it is like HIPAA compliant or Part 11 compliant or compliant with any other privacy regulations. Still, it's a step in the right direction. So getting certified in all those compliances, like ISO 27K, all those fun things, that's going to be a big thing. Now, having worked in technology for a long time, I will say that if you own the data, if the data stays on-prem and doesn't ever go up to another vendor, it is a lot easier to get certified for privacy and security. Now, that means that you have responsibility to keep that data secure and private. But there's other, if you're a publicly traded company, there's Sarbanes-Oxley. There's lots of companies that do SOX auditing just because it is a good standard to have. There's a surprising number of private companies that are not required to do Sarbanes-Oxley auditing that do it anyways. So just taking a tangent, thinking about this from a business perspective, the combination of int 8 distillation and hopefully a surplus of good GPU hardware means that we'll be able to start running some of these locally, building local inference servers before too long. Obviously, something as big and powerful as Bloom, even if it's 175 gigabytes of RAM. So what's that? That's about 24 per GPU, so that's 4. So that's still 8 24 gigabyte GPUs. So that's still going to be pricey. I think that's probably if you get used, that's still probably about 10 grand right now. But that's going to be state of the art open source model. Now, you won't have enough to fine tune it. So it usually takes someone correct me if I'm wrong, but it usually takes 4x to 10x the amount of memory to fine tune a model. So, we're still a little ways off. But, a couple more years and it'll be reasonable. Also, as the cost of the hardware, the capital investment comes down, more and more companies are going to be able to offer fine-tuning services. So say, for instance, you have a data set and you want to get Bloom fine-tuned, and you want to own it, right? So rather than go and upload your data to a web interface and then they host your fine-tuned model, they'll just give it to you. Right, so you can do fine tuning as a service, and then they can probably just sell you fine tuned models. Right, I know that from day one at OpenAI, people were asking about sharing and selling fine tuned models because there are independent consultants and small companies and startups that they just want to do bespoke fine tuning models where that's like, okay, I fine tuned this model. Now I'll sell it as a service, for whatever task, whether it's legal inference, medical, summarization, who knows, who cares, right? So there's this demand to release models. Now, this is all language models. So this takes me to this article that my fiance sent me. And so this was the inspiration for today's episode. Like, how did we get here and where are we going? So AI art has been nothing short of nothing short of like, one, it's impressive, but it's also very controversial. So there's already been cases of people submitting AI art and it winning awards, or of art hosts banning it. And so then one of the most popular prompts, is to use Greg Rakowski. And so like he's technically like, people are using his name to generate art. I read this article. It's kind of boilerplate if you're familiar with what's going on, but it was good inspiration. And it talks about how, amongst other things, the Leon data set. So there's let's see, where is it? Leon is the Leon 5B is the data set that was used to train it, and it may or may not have been like ethically built. But here's the other thing: is it crosses international borders, right? So IP laws in one nation might not apply the same that they do in another nation, and then once you train a model like in Germany or America, and the data was gathered in Germany or America, and then the model goes somewhere else, it's really confusing. Now, that's not to say that international IP laws have not been worked on for decades. They have. I pursued getting a patent many years ago, and basically it just costs 10 times as much to get international protection for your IP. But is this a derivative work? Because when you look at existing legal precedent and jurisprudence, because you're allowed to create something as long as you are adding value and creating something new. So it's called a derivative work. And by no means am I an expert on this. This is just my my hot take. So to me, it seems like you use one bit of data to train another. And so writers know this. There are many writers who actually will refuse to read other works of fiction while they're working on their own fiction, because you can't help but do neural style transfer when you're reading something and then producing your own work, because your brain is primed with that information. But the thing is, it takes human work to do that. And the same is true if you're looking at other artists and you're kind of like, looking at their art and then like, oh, I can do that, or getting some inspiration from it. I had a piece commissioned, and I pulled from 24 different artists, and I said, okay, I want something that's like this, 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 and this, and I paid for it. But this other artist, even though I gave them some inspiration from other works of art, they still put in a few dozen hours, or however long it took them, of their own work to make something new and unique. So what happens when all of that work to derive a new work is done by a machine, and all the human has to do is spend 30 seconds writing a prompt? Is that the same? And who knows? I'm not going to try and litigate this. This is obviously going to come down to probably some landmark Supreme Court cases. It's going to come down to probably actually international trade policy. I suspect that that will end up with some like NAFTA-esque, like North America Free Trade Agreement things that will talk about protecting artists and their IP and stuff. But this is going to be the first. I think that this is going to be the first major disruption. My fiance was talking to someone who was a talent. No. This was a job that she worked years ago. She worked for an indie press, and one of the founders of the indie press had been a talent scout for graphic artists. I think it was in New York or some big metropolitan area. Anyways, had been a talent scout and an agent for artists back in the 90s, 80s or 90s. But then with the rise of the internet and Photoshop and stuff, just those two things, Photoshop and internet, it completely destroyed the need for talent scouts and agents, because then they could just post their portfolios on the internet. And so, like, what we're seeing is something similar, where all the AI art is gonna, like, all my thumbnails, I do that with Dolly, right? I don't need an AI artist, and it takes me just a few seconds to do a thumbnail now. So what happens with these new technologies is things get accelerated, but it also so it makes my life faster and easier and cheaper. But then it also means that I'm not, like, scouring the internet for art, or doing something manually that takes longer. So, and that's the nature of capitalism, right? Capitalism always seeks efficiencies. So what happens to the hundreds of thousands or millions or however many graphic artists there are across the world, who suddenly can be outcompeted by a machine? And even if the quality of the first generation is not that good, this, like Dolly, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, all of these things are so good on their first just version 1. What happens a year from now when not only are they faster and cheaper, but they are better and more creative than all humans can be? So we're looking at, like, millions of people out of work, and that's kind of scary. And I think that this will ultimately be a wake-up call to people about how powerful AI can be for disruption. And then, so what's going to happen next is you're going to have pipelines, right? There's going to be, and some folks are already working on this. I wish I had brought up a link. I'll post it in the comments. But basically, there's a pipeline where you get a generation, and then you feed it through something else to, like, upscale it or fix the faces. And that's what human graphic artists do, right? Like, you do a rough sketch, and then you refine it, and then you refine it again and refine it again. And so, but that's, like, such a straightforward pipeline, and all that's being worked on. And I wrote a post on LinkedIn a couple weeks ago about how, even as a novelist, granted that's not my career, that's just what I do for fun. I wasn't worried about AI kind of replacing novels, or disrupting that, because I still have my own story to tell. However, in a couple years, once we figure out how to generate long format fiction, we're going to see an explosion. We're going to see, there are millions of books published every year right now. Soon it's going to be billions of books published every year. Just as AI art is already generating millions and millions of new images per day. So another thing that's going to happen is you're going to get this feedback loop. Someone on Twitter a few days ago kind of made this quip that's like, what happens when the AI models are all trained on AI generated data? It's coming. With the advent of language models, they're all trained on data that was generated mostly by humans, with a few, like, scripts and bots here and there. But over time, especially when you look at, like, all the synthetic data experiments I do, in the future, all the language models are going to be trained on AI-generated language. So we're entering into a very new time in terms of data and art. And I would not have predicted, I did not predict that art was going to be the first major disruption, but I think we're seeing the beginning of it now. So that's that. That is my state of the industry update. Yeah, we're in for some serious change, and that's about all I can say for certain. I have accurately predicted some things, and I have missed others, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Anyways, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon to keep the content coming. Have a good one.